Hi, welcome everyone to this webinar, which is hosted by the Centre for Autism and Theology. So my name is Henna Kundal and I'm one of the researchers with the Centre. And before I introduce our speaker today, it's my privilege to introduce Father Matthew Schneider in a few moments, but first I will briefly introduce the Centre and the work that we do. The Centre for Autism and Theology was launched in 2018 and is co-directed by Professor Grant McCaskill and Dr. Leon van Ommen. The Centre aims to host interdisciplinary research into autism in relation to theology, church and faith. So the Centre acts as something of a hub that brings together all those interested in that intersection of autism and theology. The aim is to make an academic contribution to the discourse, but also to be of service to churches and other faith communities. As part of our activities, we organise these regular webinars, and if you didn't hear about today's webinar from our mailing list, do take a look at the Centre for Autism and Theology website, where you can sign up to the mailing list and also find more details on how to get involved with the work of the Centre. You can also follow us on social media. But now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Father Matthew Schneider. Father Schneider is a priest with the Legionaries of Christ and visiting assistant professor in theology and bioethics at Belmont Abbey College. He has written on a variety of Catholic topics in many different publications and been mentioned in almost 400 different media sources. He completed his doctoral thesis in 2022 on a Catholic theological analysis of the right to informational privacy. And also in 2022, he published his book, God Loves the Autistic Mind, a prayer guide for those on the spectrum and those who love us. He's one of the most outspoken advocates for autistic Catholics and has been open about his own autism diagnosis since 2019. So Father Schneider will talk for about 45 minutes and share his thoughts with us. And after that, we'll have a 5-minute break. During that break and afterwards, there will be the opportunity to type questions into the chat box, and we'll have a time of Q&A after the break. But for now, Father Schneider, thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you very much. It's great to be at the Center. Grant McCaskill wrote a great book on autism in the church that I put his book on. I did a review of his book in, I think, Nova et Vetra, Catholic Theology Journal. But I think moving on, we need to start with the topic. And so hopefully I can share my screen here. Hopefully I'll see this. This is my PowerPoint because I like to have it a little more visual. Bring it up. I don't think, look at my face, especially autistic people are like, oh, they're looking at his face talking. Maybe not as helpful as it is for other people. But this is really going to be on what makes autistic prayer different, or kind of a summary of prayer from the autistic perspective or something like that. And so I think the first thing we need to think about when we talk about prayer is that prayer in its deepest sense is beyond human language. When any of us go to describe, any of us who spent time and really had deep experience of prayer, when we go to describe them, our language always fails. I know myself, I think of one of the deepest moments of prayer. I went to an adoration chapel to do my hour of meditation for the day, and it just felt like I was lifted up to God in that sense. And that seems totally inadequate to describe. It is totally inadequate to describe, but the reality is that prayer in its essence is beyond human language when it gets to those depths. It's beyond anything we can describe with the limited vocabulary we have. We attempt to describe it and we use analogies and things like that, but we can't really describe it as it is. It's kind of like God. You can say things about God, but you cannot ever fully describe God using human language. And at the same time, the challenge here is that every autistic person is unique, so it's hard to describe sometimes. It's sometimes hard to describe autism, right? So I'm sure you've all heard the expression, if you've met one autistic, you've met one autistic, in the sense that each person has different experiences with autism. You'll have certain general characteristics, but a lot of the details vary quite a bit person to person in that regard, and because of how we define autism in the DSM or the ICD. This isn't going to go into that, but most of you who are on the call probably know, it's you have to have a certain number of checks in a certain number of categories, and so two autistic people might have different checks in those categories. And so they have in the same general area, but not exactly the same experience. And as such, what I'm going to describe today is what I would call general aspects of autistic prayer, things would help a lot of people, but not necessarily something that's going to help every autistic person because we're just so different. And so if one thing or another doesn't apply to you, don't feel bad. Don't feel like, oh, I'm not really autistic, or oh, this isn't really true about autistics. Try and look at it as like, this is what I'm saying is true for a lot of autistics and all the different things, but not every point is true for every single person because of that difference. So here is an outline of the general idea of what I'm going to reflect on today. So the first part is going to be my book. I'm just going to summarize some basic points of autistic prayer from my book that came out in 2022. It was actually mainly written in 2020 during the pandemic, lockdown and things, but some of the basic points that go into there. And then there's going to be a second half where I'm going to go into 2 ideas for deeper reflection, where I didn't really describe those as much in my book, but they are really those deeper reflection, those aspects of ideas that I'm thinking about and are going around in my mind, and which I think can help describe autistic prayer more deeply. Now, as I go on, this is going to get more and more academic. Like the second idea for deeper, further reflection is based on Martin Buber as I and Thou, which is an academic work and things like that. So it does get a little more academic. If you get a little lost towards the end, don't feel bad if you're not an academic and you're getting lost towards the end. That's just how I'm going to structure it, so that because I think that there are some valuable things to say there, even if I might have struggled to explain all the kind of academic background in a short period of time for those who are not as familiar. So first of all, obviously my book. So these are reflections that are really, already in the book. They're a summary. They're really thought out. I've really thought about them for a long time. And I think it's good to think about how this book came about as well. So I was diagnosed in January 2016. My first assignment as a priest was as school chaplain. And the principal's like, you're not really reading the kids' social cues. Maybe you have, at the time, Asperger's. Well, actually, in the US, it just barely changed Asperger's diagnosis, but I'm not going to critique a school principal for being 1 year out of date with the diagnostic manual, because we combined Asperger's and autism at the time. And then a little later on, I did a bunch of tests in late 2015 and got a diagnosis in 2016. And the diagnosis helped me reflect and realize a lot of things in the past, and my life helped me understand that and such. But at the same time, it was kind of tough at the beginning, where I was thinking, oh, this is tough. Where am I going to go? What am I going to do? Like, how can a priest do ministry if they have this condition? But as I read and studied more on it, I realized more and more, oh, this, how this can help me in certain ways, and how this really explains a lot of things that I already knew about myself, but I didn't really think about directly. For example, it was really a revelation to me to realize how much other people process social situations subconsciously, because I'd always processed them very consciously, and things like that, and different things like that. But one of the things I kept noticing was there'd be autism in this, autism in that, autism in the other thing, but there was no like autism in Christian prayer book, really. There really wasn't a book kind of, a book length treatment of that. And so I'd look around the internet and be like, oh, and then I hope I hope somebody writes this. And then like 2-3 months later, I'd go look around the internet again. I hope somebody writes this. And after, 6 months or a year of doing this, I'm like, well, you know what? I'm studying a graduate degree of theology at the time, a licentiate degree, which is between what a normal priest does and a doctoral degree. It's kind of a super master's. It's not really, at least for American system, it doesn't really make sense to do a licentiate. Doesn't really fit in the American system well. Not as familiar with the UK system. But anyway, so I was doing that, and I was doing a licentiate, and and at the time, and I'm like, I've read like this whole shelf or two of autism books, and I've lived for 30 plus years with autistic, praying for a good portion of those. Well, maybe God's calling me to write this book. So as I thought about that, I really felt, okay, yes, this is something that I can do to help other people who are on the spectrum, other people who are autistic. So that really is how it came about. And I think really here, there are kind of three areas. I have three chapters on this in the beginning of the book, on the kind of the aspects of autism, autistic prayer. And I'm just going to go over them here in a slightly different order than the book. But I think, first of all, it's just the errors people have about autistics and prayer, some practical tips, and a little bit on the stages of prayer from an autistic perspective. So the first thing is the errors of prayer. The first idea is this idea that some people think that autistics can't pray. Now, there's kind of two versions of this. One is where I think it's just kind of an omission, where it's just kind of like they're listing all the people, we ask this group and this group and this group to pray, and they don't ask the autistics themselves to pray. There was a prayer for autism on EWTN. That was EWTN, which is the American Catholic TV channel. A number of years back, where it's like prayer for autism, they ask like the parents and siblings of autistic people to pray, but they don't ask the autistic people to pray. And I think it's more of just an oversight. They just, I'm not. And then there's others who take issue with the theory of mind, right? Like, well, how can an autistic person pray when they struggle with theory of mind? And for those not familiar, I'm just going to briefly explain theory of mind. The theory of mind is when I'm talking to you and I'm looking at your face and things, well, what kind of clues am I using to think about how you're thinking, what your mental state is, and we make a theory of what's in the other person's mind in that sense. And and autistics generally often struggle with theory of mind. But does that mean we can't pray? And I don't think so, because we can still often do theory of mind consciously, and even without theory of mind, really beyond really basic stuff, we can still communicate, and communicating to God and receiving his communication is prayer. Being with God is prayer, even if it is in some other way. Now, the second error here has 2 points, but it's really like the causes and cures of autism. So if you go, when I was writing my book in 2020, I'd go and search on autistic prayer on YouTube or prayer and autism on YouTube, and a whole bunch of the videos are like, we prayed our kids' autism out, or like prayer to release autism and things like that. And that's really like that idea that we should cure autism, we should get rid of it. But most autistics don't want to be cured. Different surveys have been done, and the results have always been in favor of, most of us, even people who have more struggles in this neurotypical world, or who are nonverbal or things like that, don't want to be cured of autism, want to have assistance to help live a healthy autistic life, not to be non-autistic in that sense. And these same people have issues with how it's caused. Sometimes they're like, oh, there's the demons or things like that, or sometimes it's more like it's parental sin or things like that. I've written a few times about a Catholic priest, Father Dominic Valenmahal. Hopefully I pronounced that right. He's an Indian priest who's talked a lot about the parental sins and how they're causing autism. But like, we look at the causality of autism as first genetic, second in utero environment, and so it's not likely to be that. There are some other things where, if your parents abandon you and things, you can have attachment issues. There are other psychological conditions that can be caused by parental sin in that sense. Like if your parents abandoned you or things like that, those are parental sins, and those could cause attachment issues, which are can cause other psychological issues. And then I just want to mention briefly this last one, this idea that autistics are somehow kind of psychic. This is kind of an idiosyncratic view by a guy named William Stillman. I think it's worth mentioning, though, because if you searched autism prayer on Amazon, when I was writing the book, his came up near the top. But his is very kind of this kind of new age yoga thing that I don't think that is a whole other, that I would have other concerns with as well. But it doesn't seem to be that like somehow being autistic, we are psychic or something, or we have some kind of like automatic spiritual gift. Sure, sometimes our simplicity, we can see things with a certain simplicity that others might, but that doesn't make us psychic or quasi-magical or things like that. Moving on to the practical ideas here, I think one of the things we have to think about with autism is what we mean by stillness, because people will quote things like, here I have Psalm 46:10, be still and know that I am God. Or when I was a little kid, it's like you pray and you hold your hands like this and you put your face up here and, like the little boy in the prayer card. I don't know if any of you others did it, but I was like, oh, there's a prayer card with the little boy praying. Okay, I'm going to imitate exactly his posture and somehow I'm going to pray. And I'm just like thinking about like, am I like exactly praying like he is? But what do we mean by stillness in that sense? Stillness is not so much that physical stillness, but that more in our nervous system, in our brain, in our psychology, that we're still there. But what happens when we look at autistic people about that? What happens when we look at them? Well, autistic people tend to have that greater stillness, interior stillness, when they are stimming, when they are doing things that calm their mind, calm their psychology, things like that, right? So briefly, for those not aware, stimming or self-stimulatory behavior are repeated actions that people do to calm themselves. A lot of people do these. Autistics tend to do them more, like almost like a lot of other people are non-autistic do them but usually to a lesser degree. Those of you who are watching my videos probably noticed I've gone back and forth my office chair here. That's a proprioceptive stimming. Like my proprioception is your awareness of where your body is in space. I know for myself, like when I go to pray, I like to sit in a rocking chair, rock back and forth, because that calms me and allows me to focus more on that relationship with God, that kind of communication with God, because of that motion there, that kind of stimming. Now, the most stereotypical one is kind of, the hand flapping, where some will flap their hands. Even when Sesame Street, the kids TV show in the U.S. decided to have an autistic character, that she was shown to commonly do that, and that's the most common one, but it's not one that I personally do a ton. I do much more of like the proprioceptive, where it's rocking back and forth or spinning my chair back and forth, like you probably see on here, because it's office chair. I mean, it doesn't really rock back and forth; it only rocks side to side. And along with the stimming, we also have kind of verbal stims, where some autistic people like to repeat little things, and they'll just repeat and repeat. And a lot of times we can do that with short prayers, right? The famous prayer of the Eastern rites, the Eastern Orthodox, Eastern Catholics, is the Jesus prayer. Lord Jesus, Son of the living God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And monks will pray this 1,000+ times a day, over and over again, where it becomes almost like breathing. And for us, sometimes that kind of repetition, that repeating those things, can be almost a verbal stim, can bring us that calmness, but also bring us that calmness in communication with God. Because if you're repeating that, 20, 30, 50, 100 times in a row, it is bringing you to mind your relationship with God, because the prayer itself is about that relationship with God, which is prayer. Our prayer is our relationship with God, our communication with God, our being with God. So by saying that, we help in that regard. And the third thing I think that's important as a practical tip is just structure and order. That we tend to have executive functioning difficulties. So if we don't know how things are going to pan out, it can be challenging for us. It's hard for us to understand how things are going. Like I went one time when I was in college, a friend invited me to a evangelical church in Canada before I was in the seminary, and I was kind of nervous that I didn't know what was coming next. Were they going to sing another praise and worship song? Were they going to read a Bible passage? Was somebody going to get up and preach? Was there going to be a testimony? Like what was next? Whereas I go to a Catholic mass, it's like I know the exact structure. We're going to start with a song, then we're going to have the introductory, then we're going to have the opening. We're going to have the name, the sign of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Then we're going to have the Confiteor, I confess prayer. Then we're going to have the opening prayer, etc., all the way through. And I think for a lot of autistic people, a liturgy like that really helps out. Now, obviously, I'm Catholic and we tend to do that, but a lot of Protestant churches can tend to be very, very organized, whereas other ones are much more kind of like these evangelical ones in the States, where it's like maybe they do have some order if you've gone regularly, but at least to me, it seems like you never know what's coming next, and that can be a little more challenging, because I like to have that kind of structure and know, okay, here's the order of relationship. And this goes the same way in other things of prayer, like I know my community tends to focus a lot on Lectio Divina as our prayer, right? That divine reading, that kind of meditative reading of the scriptures. And in that, you have an exact structure to follow, an exact rule to follow. So those three are practical tips. Now, finally, we have the different stages of prayer. Now, I follow the general structure of the stages, right? So the purgative, illuminative, and unitive. You'll find a lot of spiritual masters summarizing people like Adolphe Tancred and Gary Lagrange. But the purgative is kind of like eliminating the sins, eliminating the obstacles to be with God. Illuminative is practicing the virtues, and the unitive is God's communication, God's gift to us. And so these are not so much necessarily absolute stages, but aspects of the spiritual life that generally follow those stages. We need to purify ourselves, we need to stop sinning, and then we need to practice virtue, and then God comes to us, gives us that gift of deeper prayer. And the challenge comes in for autistics is with this theory of mind, which you mentioned back, I think it was 2 slides ago, talking about how some people think we can't pray. And that I think we can pray, but I think this can cause difficulties. So it makes it harder in the beginning once you get past the kind of very basic level of prayer, because I would call the basic level of prayer is when you go and you say a prayer, right? Like I'm saying the Our Father, I'm praying the Rosary, I'm praying the Liturgy Hours, I said all the words, right? But the next level is kind of, I'm praying those, but at the same time I'm communicating with God, and I'm as a mutual communication in that sense, as a kind of like me and God talking to each other, and so in that communication, I need that ability to have some kind of sense of what God's thinking, how He loves me, how He's feeling, how he's looking at me, right? So that could be a challenge. But at the same time, as we get further along, it can speed up, because how most neurotypicals will have this kind of subconscious filter of the theory of mind, where they're having to think through all this of what God is thinking about them, how God's thinking, and things like that. Whereas because we don't really have as many filters, once we got past that, we are able to communicate, I think, in many ways more directly with God, because we have less of those filters. Because a lot of the difficulty, a lot of the challenges for autistic people with the world as it is about those filters between the direct sense experience and our conscious realization of that sense experience. Let me just explain what I mean by that. Like, take, for instance, hopefully this is on screen there. I have a little green container here. And the direct sense experience is like the light in my room bounces off this green thing, hits the back of my retina, and it's that wavelength and it knows it's green. And now I consciously know from experience, no matter which direction it is, this is the green spearmint gum that I sometimes chew while I'm writing on my computer and things like that, because it's a stim, right? Anyways, but in that same way, like when I'm looking at somebody's face and I'm like, okay, I'm interpreting it and things like that, there's all those filters. And those filters, as you go deeper in prayer, can become that obstacle for a lot of neurotypical people, because they have those filters between what the direct, God touching their lives and their conscious experience of God's touching their lives. Whereas because we have less filters, I think once we get over this kind of prayer hump or prayer bump, that we can actually speed down and grow with a greater speed in that regard, because you don't have those things that hold back that communication. So hopefully that's helpful in that. Now here are 2 further reflections. One is a reflection on the image of God, and the second one is a reflection on the I and Now and Martin Buber, and that aspect of relationality and how it affects prayer and how it affects autism combined. Now, the image of God I've been thinking of, I did a paper in Notre Dame last fall on this, more just generally the image of God. Here it's applied to prayer. The other one on Martin Buber is actually, I think this is the first time I'm really presenting it. So feel free to critique it and everything in the questions, because this is a speculative and some ideas that I'm still developing. I don't think these are quite as secure and solid in that sense. So when we talk about the image of God, we usually refer back to Genesis 1:26-27. And let's read the whole. I'll read the whole passage. I skipped part here, but kept the most important parts, and then I'll do a little bit of an analysis of this passage. So. And this is obviously the end of the 7-day creation story, right? There's the 2 creation stories. There's the 7-day creation story, and then there's the form he added from the dust and blowing in him the breath of life creation story. I'm going to focus on this one from day 6 of the 7-day creation story, Genesis 1 to the beginning of Genesis 2. God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let him have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created him. And I emphasize male and female here because that brings up 2 aspects. First of all, it brings up that God didn't create kind of like a kind of monolithic, singular type of human being. He created both male and female. And second of all, that he created them in relationship, because male and female are in relationship. The most basic understanding of male and female when we talk about humans, we talk about animals, is which half of the reproductive process that person contributes, right? That's the kind of most basic fundamental definition of male and female. So it is a relationship, but it's also a relationship with God. And so in this, we have to think of that. Now, also in this, we should think about how we're in the image of Jesus, who is the image of God par excellence. Philippians 2, though, I think it's Philippians. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. Though he was in the form of God, he did not create equality with God, something he grasped, but he emptied himself and became a servant and things like that, right? The first creed. But in that sense, we're going back to those first two after we understand Jesus. We go back to that he didn't create anybody that way, but that means that it's not just male and female. We can think of other divisions in human beings. We can think about abled and disabled. We can think about autistic and neurotypical or holistic, whichever term you want to use. We can think about, that he created people, with a nationality. I'm Canadian, even though I live in the States, teaching here, but no matter what I do, I'm still Canadian, right? But, and there's, in nationality, there's a lot more than like a binary A or B, right? Like, you can be Canadian, Scottish, German, Irish, American, Mexican, etc. And so in that, there is all those that were created as specific beings, were created as specific individuals. And so when we look at that, and then we look at the relationality is there and all that. And the relationality is ultimately with God. It allows us to have that relationship with God because we're in his image. Relationship with Jesus because we're most in his image. And even when Jesus became man, Jesus is the image of God par excellence, but he didn't become man as a sexless human. He became man as a male human. Now, this isn't to say male is better than female or anything like this, but to say that even in that perfection of the image of God par excellence, he was still divided in a particular type of human being. He was still a Palestinian Jew. He was not kind of a undifferentiated person as far as race or tribe or whatever else, right? He was in this sense, we were all specific. And the same thing we can apply to ability, disability, autism, non-autism. And I think that that's the key point here. We can go to Summer Kennard, who wrote about this and who I am paraphrasing to a certain extent in that last little bit of reflection. But I think her kind of like, her point here is very valuable. So I'm just going to read it from her book, Of Such is the Kingdom, of Practical Theology of Disability. The prerequisite for holiness is not bodily sex or bodily ability, but being made in God's image and being restored in God's image through baptism, the whole of life of faith as members of Christ's body, right? So we have that ability to be holy, to have that communication with God, independent of whether we're able or disabled, autistic, non-autistic, male, female, Canadian, Mexican, Russian, whatever else, because God makes us holy as we are. God allows us to have that relationship with him, have that communication with him as we are. So we're going to communicate to him in an artistic way, and he's going to communicate to us in an artistic way because he makes himself like us. He makes himself like us in a way to communicate to us, right? So I know a bunch of people who are Mexican, and like they go to prayer and they feel God's voice. They hear God's voice in Spanish. I go to prayer, and even though I speak decent Spanish and I can give a homily in Spanish, God doesn't speak to me. I hear his voice in English because my English is far better than my Spanish. My Spanish always sounds, they always say it's very gringo, which is kind of a Latin American way of saying that I have a very strong accent of being like from North America, not a native Spanish speaker. And that's the reality in that sense. That is there. So how do we as autistics tend to image God in uniqueness? And I think a lot of this is in the knowledge, because autistic knowledge tends to be a little bit different. We autistics tend to be very much about special interests. Now, God's knowledge is perfectly broad and perfectly deep, right? So he knows everything. He knows every single earthenware pot that's ever been made. He knows every tree on the earth. He knows how to distinguish every single species of tree exactly, and all those types of things. Whereas most people tend to have a very broad knowledge and don't necessarily go as deep in any particular thing. Whereas we autistics will tend to have our special interests and we can know way too much about it. Where it's almost like, whoa, like to some people. I remember when I was a kid, mine was dinosaurs, and I knew way too much about dinosaurs. I haven't studied dinosaurs as much as an adult, but in that sense, like I knew, like, at one point I could identify like 50 or 75 dinosaurs from pictures and things like that. Now my nephew is getting into dinosaurs, but not nearly as much as I did. But in that sense, we can have that deep knowledge, and that way reflects God's knowledge, like in a way that's slightly different from a neurotypical person who has much more broad knowledge, but not quite as deep. And I think this really gets into also knowledge of God. And because everything in creation is in a way reflection of God's wisdom, God's plan, all of that he puts into creation as providence. So we have Saint Basil the Great Eastern Father, and he talks about divine simplicity and our knowledge of it in letter 234. He also talks about some other places, like I think it's against Edomus, have to get the exact name. But anyways, this is the quote I chose for today. Knowledge of the divine essence involves perception of his incomprehensibility, and the object of worship is not that of which we comprehend the essence, but of which we comprehend that the essence exists, right? So we never can fully comprehend his essence. God's essence is beyond us. Ipsimus is subsistence, the very subsisting acts of being, if you study Christian metaphysics, either theology or philosophy there. But in that sense, we can grasp aspects of it, right? We can never comprehend the essence, but we can know that the essence exists. We can grasp aspects of it, and so that knowledge of knowing God, knowing Him deeply, we can know Him in Himself, and that less of a filter allows us to more closely grasp His essence. I think in some ways, possibly. So that is the reality. Now, finally, we as autistics can know God. We know God. Everybody, autistics and non-autistics, knows God most of all through prayer. So we image Him through prayer, right? And that's really that relationship, that communication, that being with, and that's how we are in His image. Now, finally, on this idea of the image of likeness, how do we do this relationship, right? There's a difference in a relationship I have with another human being and I have with a pet or with a wild animal or anything like that, right? Like there is because, and why? Because we're both in God's image. We both have that ability for communication, ability for relationality, which we're going to get into the next part more. And we have that shared image, and we can do that. And we also, one of the things I think I mentioned earlier, that idea that God speaks to us artistically, that because we are in His image and he knows everything about human beings, and He knows all the language and all the modes of speak, He's going to speak to us artistically. And I think all of us, well, at least most of us who are artistic, have experienced how there's like normal English and autistic English, and they're very similar. And when I'm describing something analytical, they're almost exactly the same. But if I'm describing if I'm talking a social relationship, a lot of times they can be different because we're taking on a very literal or stricter meaning of the words, and we definitely get the denotation, the dictionary definition, but not necessarily the connotation, the kind of implied meaning of the word in this particular circumstance that might mean something completely different than the actual dictionary definition. And so for a lot of times with the world, with people out there, we have to speak almost quasi second language of being like, standard English, even though we learned English from when we were able to crawl around on the ground. We understood it in autistic ways. We understood it very literalistically. And so, but God is able to communicate to us in a way that matches our own language in that sense. So I think that is really important when we think about how we are in the image and likeness of God. Now, moving on to relationality, and we have 10 minutes, and so I don't know how much I'm going to get in this. I might kind of shorten this a little bit, but we will go into it. We'll hopefully get a bit out of it. So this is a reflection on Martin Buber's distinction between the IU and the IN. Now, the IU is a relationship with a person. The IN is a relationship with a thing, right? Like I pulled out my spearmint gum from here, And this is obviously an it. This is not a you. Whereas if I show here, I can't see my own video. You see in the corner that there's a little picture in the background. That's me on the day of ordination of diaconate with my mom and my dad. It's the only picture. It's the only picture in the corner that's on screen. Now, obviously, I'm going to have a different type of relationship with my mom and my dad than I am with a pack of gum. But there is a way in which autistics tend to make less of a distinction here than often neurotypicals do. And this is going to become valuable when we go from the I small u to the I capital U, right? Like IU between humans and IU between God. So hopefully this is helpful. Hopefully this is not confusing. If you don't understand this, I apologize. I'm trying to explain it as best I can in 10 minutes. So Martin Buber's I and Thou, which is a great work of philosophy of the 20th century. So he distinguishes the IU and the I relationships, right? That, he says the basic word IU can only be spoken with one's whole being, with one's whole person. The basic word I can never be spoken with one's whole being, right? Because I'm with my whole being to my mom. It's not my whole being. It's a lesser thing, right? And in that we have the world of experience is the basic world of I, right? I look at all these things on my desk. I have a little bit of a mess on my desk, and I see that gum, I see other things. I see this like can of seltzer water I was sipping on. And it's all I. I don't have a personal relationship with this. But, the thing is that persons to others become a you, not an it. I relate differently if I don't know, one of the priests I live with comes in and says, "Hey, Father Matthew, how are you doing?" and things like that, right? Then I do if I just have like a recording of his voice on my phone. There's a difference in that relationship, right? Again, quoting Buber, man becomes an I through a you. What confronts us and vanishes, relational events take shape and scatter, and through these changes crystallize. This is more and more each time the consciousness of the constant partner of the I consciousness, in that sense that we are aware of ourselves as I, in the sense that we become aware of others as you, and we aren't just individuals put into this world of things. We are individuals put into this world with other individuals, so that relationship of I-you helps to develop our personal awareness in that sense, right? And the big difference here is that we tend to distinguish these two realms less. We tend to see it a little bit less, right? So there is the idea of, we often personify comfort items. You'll hear autistics talk about, their favorite teddy bear, almost, like it's a person, and you'll see, not necessarily exactly like it. And you also see at the same time that oftentimes there's even we're face blind. We have struggle with faces. We have struggle with understanding persons, individuals. There was even an autistic comic called Growing Up Outie, which depicted all the other people other than the main characters, all their faces just as kind of like these kind of just outlines. You just had an outline of face, and you didn't really have anything distinguished characteristics. That kind of anonymization of other persons, that struggle in understanding other persons, and how oftentimes we're conscious in processing nonverbal cues. So it isn't kind of that subconsciously recognizing the other person as person, but we're kind of consciously making that reality the case because we consciously work through it. I know for myself, I consciously work through a lot of social cues that I've been told by other neurotypicals, like, you think about that? I just do that automatically. I never thought about that in my life, and things like that. So that is the reality. But the challenge is we have this I-you with humans, and we have this I capital U with God. And this is relational and not just a sensory aspect, right? It is something that's outside of time. As Buber notes, the I world hangs together in space and time. The you world does not hang together in space and time. The individual you must become an it when an event or relationship runs its course. The individual it can become a you by entering into that relationship, right? So this is the idea where we have in our society where oftentimes we reduce you to an it. We have these kind of relationships where it's like, oh, you follow each other on social media, or you follow some celebrity on social media, and there's maybe a parasocial relationship, but really these are it's where your relationship to them is as if they were a series of paintings by a single artist, that this fashion model or whatever. And their relationship to you is like, okay, I get money if I have I get more money for my sponsorships if I have another 100,000 followers or whatever else, right? So it's reducing the person to an it. And this is necessarily a problem, because we need to treat persons as persons and things as things. And the I in the I it is an ego, which is alone, right? The I it is alone. I'm in this world alone. I am looking at all these experiences. I look out the window and there's like green trees, and there's a brown or red, I'm not sure exactly what color, it's kind of a brownish red fence and things. Those are things, and I'm just here with my ego relationship to them. But through the screen, I'm talking to all of you, I'm looking at the one person who appears on my screen. and that's a you, that's a person, and that's a different relationship. That is a person, and that is a person that is outside of time. That is a relationship that's outside of time. Now, this is really where it gets to God, is that Buber points out that God is you in an even more powerful way. We can't even make him an it by an analogy. Even when we say like God is a he, that's by analogy. When we say God, you, that is not an analogy, because it is a relationship, and he is the one who shows us the trueness of our I. So I'm going to read a long quote from Buber on this, and I have 5 minutes, so I'm a little rushing here because I realize the time, but hopefully this is helpful. So this is Buber writing. By its very nature, the eternal you, i.e. God, cannot become an it, because by its very nature cannot become placed within measure and limit, not even by the measure of the immeasurable and the limit of the unlimited, because by its very nature it cannot be grasped as the sum of quantities, not even the infinite sum of quantities that be raised to transcendence, because not found either in or outside the world, because it cannot be experienced, because it cannot be thought, because we transgress against that which has being, right? So this whole idea is that there is a God who is beyond all this, and the you is in a way outside of space and time, whereas the it is in the space and time, in the reality, in that kind of me and all these sensory experiences, where the you is outside of time, me and the relationship with all these people. So continuing on to Buber. If we say, I believe that he is, even he is a metaphor, while you is not, because you is that relationship again. And yet reduce the eternal you ever again to an it, to something, turning God into a thing in accordance with our nature. And we falsify God in that reality. This is kind of the critique of all forms of polytheism and paganism, but it's also something we have to be aware of as Christians, to say, okay, in what way might I be reducing God? In what way might I not be grasping the fullness of God's nature, the fullness of God's transcendence, the fullness of God's reality for me? And in this you, this all caps you, that relationship we have with God, because the relationships, the IU is always outside of time and space, but God himself is outside of time and space, so it can only fully be experienced as a you, not as an it. We can't, like, I can reduce a person to an it because I can just look at them, look at all the photos they post on Instagram and reduce those to, like, as if they're just paintings or AI drawings or something like that, because I can sense it. The I it is a sense, but God is beyond sensation, so we cannot reduce him to an it, even if we try. So now we return to the challenge. How do autistics have that I-you with God? How do autistics relate differently to God, given how we distinguish less between I it and I-you? Right? We can also make this distinction between the I-you small letters and I-you all caps less, like we make that distinction between the I it and I-you less. But we also have a danger where, because we can almost reduce the I small u to an I it, we can also, in that same process, reduce the I all caps u to an I it. And that misses the IU completely, because God by his nature cannot become an it, because he cannot be experienced sensationally, like sensorially, like that. He has to be experienced only in that relationship. And this is the challenge. the challenge we have in teaching autistic prayer is to reach the IU in that same kind of like level of very little difference between the I it and the I small u. So this is the challenge. And this leads to a profoundness that's beyond words, right? The first day I started with the introduction, a prayer when you get to the deepest levels is beyond words. It's not something that we can just like define and with exact human words. It goes beyond human words. And we have finally this radical trust because we depend on the IU. We depend on that relationship because it is by God's will that we exist, by God's will that we are loved, by God's will that we have all the relationships we have. So finally, just quoting Martin Buber's, I am now talking about prayer and I'm applying this to autistic prayer. It is all encompassing. So let's just read this. And this is going to be the last slide before a little quick summary and conclusion. One should be aware altogether of understanding the conversation with God as something that occurs merely apart from or above the everyday. God's address to man penetrates the events in all our lives and all the events of the world around us. Everything biographical and everything historical turns into instruction, into demands for you and me, event upon event, situation upon situation, is enabled and empowered by this personal language to call upon the human person to endure and to decide. So we have this thing where in this kind of compression, the I it, IU, and all caps U, we can have God penetrate into all of our lives and make our whole lives a prayer, right? So that idea of praying always that we have in the scriptures, we can really live out by doing this and the autistics and re-autistics in a way, because we make less of a distinction, can have a degree of profoundness, a way of experiencing this that would be different from others. So a few points to leave with, a few kind of like conclusory points. So first of all, we can pray. We go through the same process as others, but we may find some parts easier and harder, right? I talked about how it tends to be hard at the beginning to get over the theory of mind, then easier at the end as we have less of a filter holding us back. Then we talked about prayer methods. We talked about how structure and stimming can help calm us. We talked about how we're in God's image. Oh, typo there. It's a way to share in prayer and that communication. And then finally, we talked about a relationality week, how we combine and we distinguish less between the I it and the IU and how that might affect our relationship with God. Thank you very much. Hopefully that was helpful. And if you have any questions, we have the question period next. You can find me frmatthewlc or Autistic Priest on social media and frmatthewlc.com.
Thank you very much. If there's one thing I love more than existential philosophy, it's existential philosophy delivered at double speed.
Sorry. Yeah, I'm not sure. I was a little fast at the end because I realized I was going a little over. So hopefully that doesn't confuse too many people. If you missed that, if you didn't get understand the last section, don't worry. It was a little it was a little complicated.
There's some really interesting ideas there, and I think they're going to generate quite a lot of discussion though. So thank you so much. So we're going to move to a 5-minute break now. During that time, please feel free to keep putting questions into the Q&A that some of you have already. If you're confused as to why your question hasn't appeared yet on your screen, it's just because they go through a moderation process. So they will go through the moderator and be published for everybody to see shortly and over the next few minutes. We will try not to use your names while we talk about the questions, because this is being recorded and will hopefully be broadcast. But if you want to make extra sure, then do tick the checkbox to remain anonymous as you're posting your question. Please remember to be succinct with your questions. Nobody wants a 5-minute long question after a presentation. And try to stick to asking questions of Father Schneider and not just posting comments. So we'll take a 5-minute break now and return at about 5:05 BST. I don't know what that is in your time zone, Father Schneider.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's 5 hours later. So right now it is right about noon here.
Okay. So we'll be back at 12:05 to address some of the questions. Well, welcome back, everyone. I think if you're ready, Father Schneider, we'll have a little look at some of the questions that have come in. There's been a few which were sort of grouped together about theory of mind, and that particular theory of autism, which has received a lot of scholarly critique and challenge in the last few years, and especially since Damien Milton published his theory of the double empathy problem in 2012. So I wonder if you're interested just to kind of expand a bit on why you went along with the theory of mind way of framing the autistic experience. Just to read out the questions here. So one person comments, I'm not sure the theory of mind theory tracks. It's been widely queried by academics, etc. Theory of mind is not lacking in autistics, but is challenging or impossible cross neurotype, leading neurotypicals to believe we lack theory of mind. So if we accept that theory of mind is typically present between matching neurotypes, for example, autistic to autistic communication, this has different implications for your theory of mind theory regarding prayer. What do you think about this?
Do you want to just answer? Do you want to just read the second question, which is almost the same? Because I think it's just to answer both together.
Sure. Yeah. So, given that God loves the autistic mind and we are created in God's image, why do you frame your stages of prayer in theory of mind, which is a deficit-based and largely debunked theory of autism? Wouldn't double empathy and monotropism that are more neurodiversity affirmative be more appropriate?
Well, I think actually this is something where I've actually been thinking about it, and maybe this is kind of the time to move in the description that way, because I do think that idea of the double empathy is actually a better explanation of autism, especially talking about between people. When I wrote the book, which was a few years ago, I really thought about that. Was the double empathy was still not, even though it had been published, it was not super dominant at the time. It was in the literature, but it wasn't as definitive as it's been as it has become in the last few years, at least from what I was reading. And I think actually that is a better way to explain it. And I totally realized that, like, I just kind of summarized my book, but now I think about it, I should modify this and explain it better in that regard, because I do think that the double empathy problem does still have very similar results, because, we're going to be taught to pray by neurotypical people generally, and they're going to explain it in a neurotypical way. And so that understanding of God or of our relationship with him will be a neurotypical understanding, and our way to relate to God, relate to others, is going to be that neurotypical way. And so I think that, talking about it that way is probably a better way, now that I was approached with this, and that's a good point, because I generally kind of agree with that idea, that the double empathy is a better explanation in that sense. And I think for the future I will change that, because that is a good point from those two people in that regard. But I do think a lot of the explanation would be similar, because we'd be taught to pray generally by neurotypical people who teach us to understand God's mind in a neurotypical way of understanding God's mind, not in a autistic way of understanding God's mind. And that is a good point. So that's definitely something to improve for the future.
That's great. Thank you so much for that response there to those questions. I wonder as well, another sort of theme that's coming up through the questions is this question of an autistic mind. So one person has said, I'm autistic and I don't have special intents, interests or literal language, so the generalization is not accurate. And I see this actually in some of the other recent publications about autism and prayer, this idea that there is an autistic mind, sort of almost as if it's sort of one thing. So I wonder, do you want to expand a bit on what you mean when you use that kind of terminology?
Well, I think it goes back to what I was saying right at the beginning of the presentation, where I said, look, this is talking about the autistic mind in general, and different points are going to be different for different people. So if somebody is autistic but doesn't have special interests, well, that point doesn't really apply to them, and that's just how it is. But I do think there are differences in how autistics view the world, like we talked about the double empathy in the last one, or even just like that we tend to have less filters or slightly different filters in how we perceive the world. And so things like that, or how we relate to the world, things like that are differences, right, in how we are there. And like, obviously, different people have different aspects of autism stronger than others in that sense. So if somebody doesn't have one aspect or another, I totally understand that. And that's why I was kind of like having that aspect at the beginning to say, hey, look, this is as much as I can generalize it, but I don't think every point is going to apply to every person who's autistic, because we're so different that there's no real way to speak about autism that doesn't like, no matter what I say about autism, almost, it's not going to apply to 100% of autistic people. And so I'm saying most of these apply to at least a good portion of autistic people. I totally admit that not every point I make applies to every autistic person, and I thought I tried to make that clear at the introduction, because that's, they're so different that it's hard to define that.
Yeah, super. Thank you for responding to that one. If we stick with individual autistic experience for now, which means, so I'm not going through the questions in the exact order that they come up now, I hope that's okay, but just thinking if we sort of stick with individual experience, and then we could look maybe at some of these questions about engaging with the church more broadly. So a little bit further down, one person has asked, given that we autists have special interests, so if we work with the premise that some do, or many do, I liked your use of boober and suspect this might be part of the answer, but I've recognised obsessiveness as unhealthy, and this concerns me. And this is interesting. This was an initiating incident for my own research project, where I had a psychologist say, she would never advise an autistic person to follow spiritual practices for their mental health because of a concern she had that they could become obsessive. And I thought, oh, really? Really? So I'd be interested to hear if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I think first of all, we have to distinguish where a special interest or is unhealthy or obsessive in a problematic way. Like I myself am, teach theology at university level, and theology in a way is a special interest of mine. So I like to talk about myself as like a walking encyclopedia of theology. And, because I'm able to use that at university, there's very little that's, and that's my full-time job and everything. It's very little in that regard that's going to be unhealthy or, unduly obsessive for me in that situation. Now, obviously, I think there can be places where that can happen, where, your special interest is some TV show or something, and there's no real like job that you can do with that, and you're not, you're so obsessed over that you can't work or things like that. But because I think in general, those of us who can work, not every autistic person can, should strive to do something productive, in that sense. And so I don't think spiritual practices necessarily are any more or less possibly problematic than like a TV show or other things like that. So I don't see where the particular thing about like a spiritual practice is bad versus becoming really obsessed with Sailor Moon and knowing all the Sailor Moon lore backwards, forwards, and having the Sailor Moon encyclopedia memorized or something like that. I'm just giving a random example. I don't know why that was the TV show that came to mind, but in that sense, that can be the reality. And I think it's even less so because spiritual practices are often helpful for us in ways that just relaxing in front of the TV or watching something special interest, whatever it is, may not be if it's just a general special interest or just an entertainment special interest. Now, I'm not to say that there can't be a place where it could become unhealthy and obsessive, but I think that is less of a sort of spiritual aspects than it is with like almost any other kind of like aspects, any other kind of special interest. So I wouldn't be so concerned about that in that regard, because we're going to have that tendency no matter what the special interest, almost no matter what the special interest is. There's a few exceptions, like if you can become a professor in your special interest, then all of a sudden it's hard to be problematic in that sense. But hopefully that's helpful.
Great, thank you. Okay, I wonder if we can turn then to some of the questions that are asking about engagement with the church and church practice. So there's one asking, do you have any advice for an autistic person being able to engage in small group prayer. I find that really hard, writes the questioner, but feel compelled to try and do it. I'm not sure if this is because of a spiritual requirement or social pressure. And I thought that was quite interesting and relates to another question a little bit lower down. Autistic people can have a very deep non-verbal or relational prayer, but can struggle with the traditional and communal forms of prayer. So again, struggling with praying with other people there. How can we help neurotypical, I think, people understand this and not disregard our spirituality? Also, when teaching people, children or adults, about God and prayer, can we skip to the deeper prayer since the earlier stages are harder? Maybe that's a separate question. But yeah,
well, I think these are both kind of important questions. I myself am definitely more of the tendency of thinking about the personal prayer rather than like group prayer per se. I think that there's two kinds of group prayer that are important to distinguish here, because you'll have like systematic group prayer, whether it's, you go into the liturgy, the mass, the service, whatever you want to call it on Sunday, and it's kind of following an order, or you're praying like we Catholics, we pray the rosary, you say, you say the mystery, like the Annunciation and the Incarnation of our Lord, then you pray an Our Father, then you pray 10 Hail Marys, then you pray a Glory Be, and then you go to the next mystery and things like that. So it's very structured. And for me, at least, those are very easy to do, because it's like got that structure to keep me in line. Whereas I definitely see the sense of the challenge of, now we're going to each spontaneously say our own prayer. Okay, like in that challenge of transmitting my personal experience, my deep direct experience, and that kind of into a human language that they would understand, and that could definitely be a challenge. I don't really have a solution for it. I kind of say, how can you do great in small group prayer? I think sometimes, at least for me, it's much easier to engage in a kind of Bible study type prayer, where it's like, hey, we read a passage of the Bible, we reflect on it, because I definitely can reflect on that well. But if it's just kind of like spontaneously pray to God, it's like, out loud, that is a certain difficulty for me as well, I would say. I'm not horrendous, because I've, been very involved for years, but I could, it's not the easiest thing for me, and I can imagine that being difficult for other autistic people. And I would think that is that's an important aspect, not to get worried that like, oh, I don't feel, called to specific things. Don't feel like, autism can affect that or whatever. I know for myself, the charismatic renewal type Catholics, which are much more kind of, praise and worship, things like that. I went to a few times to the services when I was younger, and I was like, it just doesn't, like, I don't feel like connected to this. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, it's like the church is here with many slightly different variations of prayer. And God wants us to pray. He doesn't necessarily say, oh, you have to pray this specific prayer every single day. As Catholics, we understand that God wants us to go to Mass every Sunday, and he wants us to pray every day. But what does he want us to pray every day? He just wants us to pray. We can, whatever prayer connects you most to God. So don't feel obliged to a specific type of prayer if that doesn't speak to you, doesn't help you communicate with God. But at the same time, look for those ones that do. Don't just say, oh, my church does this type of prayer as their prayer group doesn't really speak to me, I'm just going off. No, try and find the one that works for you and that helps you to really communicate with God the most. And then the other question, the deeper prayer, to skip to deeper prayer since the earlier prayer stages are harder. I think that can be sometimes helpful, because ultimately the deepest level of prayer is the unitive, where it's fully God's gift, God working in us. And so I think we can sometimes try and communicate that, but I think that's something as God's gift that God usually gives after, we strive to communicate with him for a little bit. Obviously all prayer is God's gift, but like that degree of that unitive level is God's gift in a profound way, where it's totally, an experience way beyond words, way beyond anything we can talk about in this world. In that sense, and I think we do need some kind of preparation for that. Maybe if I think about it, if people think about it, or people are able to prepare slightly differently, that would be great too. It's not to say that like this is the only way. I've read a bunch on kind of, and I follow the more classical structure of kind of a, like I mentioned, the Tanqueray, Gary Lagrange, the kind of 3 stages of spiritual life type structure. And I'm not saying that that's universal. That's a generally helpful structure. It's not a kind of like straitjacket in that sense. You have to do it exactly this way. And if you don't do it exactly this way in this box, you're wrong. But something of that, some kind of preparation is helpful in that regard. So hopefully that's helpful for both those questions.
Great, thank you. I'm interested as well that you say about prayer being God's gift to us in what you've just said, because there is a question that also pushes in that direction very theologically. So one person asks, you say that autistics can pray. Surely it is not our ability to pray, but God enabling us to do so. I don't know if you want to share any more thoughts on that.
Well, definitely that's it's always that prayer is always God's gift because we're powerless to do it on our own. It is God's gift in that sense, right? And when we say, we can sometimes use language like we autistics can pray, but obviously we mean that God gives every single person, including autistics, the gift of prayer, more than like we have some specific ability to that, because ultimately prayer is God's gift, God's call to us to pray. Even if we're just saying something as simply, I'm saying the Our Father, it's a response to God's call to me. It's not like, oh, I have the power to say the Our Father. Well, yes, you as a human being have the power to speak that series of 50 words or whatever exactly it is, the Our Father. But it is only by God's gift that becomes a prayer, not just stating something out loud. Like, I memorized the speech of like Abraham Lincoln or something like that. Oh, I can say that, and that's within like the human capacities here, right? 7 years ago, our forefathers, the Americans will get that one. That's the beginning of his famous Gettysburg Address. But probably one of the most famous speeches in American history. But hopefully that helps that person.
Great, thank you so much. It looks like we're sort of drifting back in the direction of individual autistic experience here. So there's quite an interesting point, which makes me think a lot about the things that Donna Williams published about autism some years ago, which is obviously still very prevalent texts. So the question is, we as autistics may attach to objects, a favorite book, chair, etc., and yet may have a harder time connecting to other people. Are we extending you-ness to objects while missing it in other people? What do you think?
I think there is. I think it's much more of, I kind of described it in the talk, and I think of it much more as kind of like a reducing the distance between the two than like necessarily applying you-ness, like you-ness to the object, because we do apply a certain degree of you-ness to it, and we do apply a certain degree of itness to people at times. Unfortunately, we should try and avoid that one, as much as we can. Obviously there's certain aspects that happen with outside of our rational control, but as much as we have the choice, we should avoid reducing people to its. But in that sense of, it's kind of we're closer together in those, whereas other people, neurotypicals, tend to make a bigger distinction between those, and that's hopefully what I was getting at. I don't think, I doubt there's many autistic people, who would say, even ones who have a very strong attachment, who would put, I don't know, their stuffed teddy bear or whatever, their comfort object, above the person they love the most, whether that's their spouse or their girlfriend, boyfriend, their mom, dad, sisters, brothers, etc. Like you might put it above, in a relationship, above some kind of like random humans that you encounter in your day-to-day life, and that like less of a distinction there. But you're unlikely to put it above like your best friend or your mom or whoever that is closest to you. It might, not to say some have bad relationships with parents, so it's like, yeah, they put it with their parents, but in general, assuming it's a good relationship, or the people you love the most. So that's a good question, though.
Great. Now I wonder, whether in your pastoral practice you've had much contact yet with the non-speaking autistic community. So we've had one question come in sort of from that perspective, saying, I don't know if it's, oh, sorry, hang on, it moved on my screen just as I started to read it. Do you think there may be a difference between autistic non-speakers and autistics who speak? I'm in a group of many non-speakers, and we would disagree with many of your characterizations. It's a pity it doesn't say what in particular there, but whether you anticipate that. They are not part of our experience. So what experience have you had with that community?
I'll admit I've had a limited experience, like directly in person. I've talked to a few kind of over the internet and things like that. When I did my book, I tried to find as many people as I could to answer a short questionnaire on prayer. It was more about like how you view prayer and what are your most profound moments of prayer. And a number of those stories got into the stories that were given. They got into the book with pseudonyms because I was respecting everybody's privacy there. But a number of those I think were non-speaking because I just kind of like went through a various autistic Facebook and Reddit and Twitter and all those things to try and find people who wanted to talk about their prayer life. And I got like 25, I think 25-ish. And yeah, I have not had as much direct experience, in person with them. Most of the autistic people I've dealt with in person for whatever reason have been speaking. I've dealt with, a few, and at least the ones I've talked to online via written communication, through typing mainly, obviously. I haven't noticed like too much that's like dramatically different. Beyond sometimes like a further difference in language where they see a bigger difference than say like an average between like their speech and like kind of neurotypical English, or their English is much more like an ESL, not ESL, sorry, ESL is the wrong term. ASL, American Sign Language. There's a British one too, but I don't know it. I know ASL is the American Sign Language because a number of them will learn sign language if they're unable to communicate through speech, because that way at least they can communicate there. And even if they use like a iPad, AAC, augmented alternative communication device, that tends also to be much more like ASL, where the thing about ASL is like when you do a sentence in ASL, the first thing you say is like the emphasis word, whatever it is. So like if I was going to say, I will give you $10, as the debate was whether I was going to give you 5 or 10, I would say $10 I will give you. I'd sign that out. And that's a different way of communicating. And at least the ones I know who are deaf tend to think about all things like that, or who's ASL in general, whether they're deaf or nonverbal, whether the issue, which direction the issue is, whether it's like communicating outwardly, speaking, or listening in deafness, have tended to think about that. So I would I have that aspect, and I admit I'm not like, I don't have tons of experience in that aspect, because most of the people who I've spoken to or typed with or other things have been speaking autistic people. So if this person wants to share what specific aspects, I'd love to know so I can improve in case I give similar presentation in the future.
That's great. Well, I'm sure they can reach out to you to share some more of their thoughts if they want to as well, because you put your contact details up. So we'll see if we can connect that up. There's another one about words, sort of going the opposite direction here. It says, I don't know if it's because I'm autistic and I like words a lot, but the idea of praying in tongues just doesn't work for me, and I feel more disconnected from God. Do you have a view on if this is a practice all Christians should persevere with?
I would say it's, if you feel it, that call, praying with tongues is a good Christian practice, but it's definitely far from a required Christian practice. Like I said myself, I went to charismatic renewal type stuff in the Catholic Church, which is more of that, like more along that line, not necessarily that specific prayer thing. And I just didn't feel called to it, and so I not really persevered. And that's not something I really done myself a ton, because it didn't feel like it connected me to God. I didn't feel like that. I didn't feel drawn to it. I felt drawn much more to, hey, let's do a Lectio Divina, read the Bible, reflect on it in personal prayer. And that's the kind of prayer I felt called to. So that's where I've gone with, with where I am with myself. And, I know some churches really emphasize that, and that's a whole other theology issue that would be kind of outside of the scope of this kind of discussion. And between that version of Protestantism and other Protestants and Catholics together, who generally say it's nice if it happens, but no requirement.
That's great. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. I think we're coming to the end of our time. So I'm hoping that somebody behind the scenes is about to make a nice slide for the CAT Centre for Autism and Theology, will appear on the screen shortly. But it just remains to me to thank you very much, Father Schneider, for coming and talking to us today and sharing about your book. And I guess if people have further questions, it's okay for us to connect them up with you.
Yeah, they can send me a note online. It's just frmatthewlc on almost every social media, frmatthewlc.com, and Autistic Priest on Facebook and Twitter. All those, I'll see them usually within 24, 48 hours. Not able to respond to every single question. Sometimes try and respond to at least the first one. Sometimes people have like 30 questions. I can't get to all of them, but that hopefully I can help more people in this regard.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much. And just to repeat what I said at the start, that if you would like to find out more about what's happening at the Centre for Autism and Theology, do visit the website, which should be appearing on your screen now as a link, and sign up to the mailing list so that you don't miss any of our future webinars. And we look forward to seeing you again.